I've been scrolling all morning and I'm seeing the same thing over and over again. Empty Targets, empty Walmarts, empty big box stores that are usually packed so tight on Black Friday that you can barely breathe. And that tells me one thing. Y'all showed up. You did exactly what you said you were going to do.
America thought it could control the world forever until one morning its stores opened and the shelves were empty. No food, no grain, no canned goods. A nation built on abundance suddenly felt fear for the first time in generations. And while Americans demanded answers, Africa delivered the message the world never expected to hear. The days of unfair trade were over.
While strolling through Walmart, I noticed that it was very empty in the store. It is the first of the month, no SNAP benefits out. Wow, Walmart is feeling the crunch.
For decades, Africa fed nations that mocked it, controlled it, and profited from its resources. The world laughed at African poverty while African farmers kept global markets alive. But now the tables have turned, and Africa stopped begging, stopped waiting, stopped apologizing, and the United States discovered what happens when a continent it underestimated finally stands up. Panic wasn't caused by famine. Panic was caused by power shifting, and this time, Africa holds it.
Bernard Arnault has reacted to many luxury stores being empty after all of the talk of manufacturers speaking out. Luxury brands are getting called out left and right, and the cracks in their billion-dollar image are starting to show big time for many.
So I'm on my way into Walmart to see how many people are shopping on Black Friday. This is my Walmart where I work at, and we're just gonna see how busy it is. And let's see what everybody looking to buy, because I see some people that's kind of speeding ahead.
The crisis began quietly, without sirens, without explosions, without dramatic warnings. It started with something simple: shelves that were normally overflowing in every major American store suddenly half empty, then three-quarters empty, then bare. The first people who noticed assumed it was temporary, another short-lived supply issue like the country had experienced before, but this time nothing was restocked. Inside supermarkets, customers stared at gaps where rice, beans, flour, cooking oil, and canned foods once sat stacked to the ceiling. Panic spread faster than news. The United States had always believed that it was immune to shortages, immune to disruption, immune to collapse. For most Americans, hunger was a distant concept, something that happened in war-torn nations or unindustrialized regions, but not at home.
The blackout worked. Those aisles were supposed to be shoulder to shoulder all day. Instead, they were wide open. That's not a glitch. That is a message. And the message landed when the biggest shopping day of the year looks like a Tuesday morning in July. Trust me, they felt it.
Yet within days, grocery aisles painted a different reality. The world's richest country suddenly looked vulnerable. Outside the US, a louder story was unfolding. Global analysts traced the root of the crisis to one shocking shift. Africa had halted exports of essential foods and agricultural goods to the United States. What made it more dramatic was not only the scale of the cutoff, but the message attached to it. African nations announced in a joint broadcast that they were tired of decades of unfair trade, artificial pricing, and economic pressure from the United States. For years, Africa had sold agricultural products at undervalued rates, while the U.S. used tariffs, sanctions, and corporate power to suppress African agriculture on the global stage. Now the balance of power had reversed. The statement that echoed across the world was bold: Africa would no longer feed countries that refused to respect Africa's growth, sovereignty, and development. The announcement was coordinated across West Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, and Southern Africa, a move the United States never imagined possible. Africa had always been treated as fragmented, divided, and dependent. Suddenly, it was unified, strategic, and unwilling to be taken advantage of again. The hypocrisy was undeniable. The world saw it, Africa saw it, and for the first time, Africa had enough economic leverage to demand respect. What shocked the United States the most was not that Africa cut exports, it was that Africa didn't do it alone. China backed the move. Middle Eastern grain investors supported it. South American Exporters aligned with it. Countries that once relied on U.S. markets now relied on African markets instead. Agriculture had become geopolitical power, and Africa held more of it than anyone realized. Inside the United States, anger on television could not hide fear in the streets. People rushed to stores hoping to stockpile food that wasn't there. Some argued that America should simply switch suppliers, but switching wasn't possible. Africa had become one of the world's largest food suppliers, producing staples under new mechanized farming systems. The United States had outsourced so much agricultural labor overseas that it no longer had the domestic capability to replace African imports quickly. The country had spent decades prioritizing corporate profit over food security. Now it was paying the price. Meanwhile, African nations continued explaining their stance calmly and confidently. They were not punishing American citizens. They were demanding structural change. Africa would export again, but only under fair contracts that respected African farmers, African prices, and African sovereignty. The continent was no longer begging for a seat at the global table. It was building its own table and deciding who had the privilege to sit. American media attempted to paint Africa as hostile and unreasonable, but a wave of international opinion crushed that narrative. Asian nations reminded the world that the U.S. had imposed sanctions on developing countries for decades without concern for civilian suffering. Latin American commentators stated plainly that unfair trade had been normalized only because wealthy nations benefited from it. African economists released decades of hidden records showing how the United States had intentionally kept African agriculture undervalued to maintain low-cost imports. It wasn't just a trade dispute anymore, it was exposure, and at the center of it all stood a truth that shocked many Americans. Africa was not angry. Africa was tired of exporting raw goods and importing poverty, tired of watching American corporations control African food systems, tired of being treated as a resource, not a partner. The world expected Africa to protest in silence, negotiate from weakness, and compromise for survival.
Walmart is in big trouble because it is Black Friday, and if you look online, Walmarts are empty. People are boycotting Black Friday, specifically Walmart. I don't even know why. Do you guys know why they're blacklisting them, boycotting them? I love it because personally, seeing all those people on Black Friday in the lines and it's like 4 a.m. and they open the doors and they're tackling each other for a 42-inch screen TV. What are we doing here, folks? Huh? Aren't we better than all these material items, huh? Aren't we better than just being consumers?
Instead, Africa disrupted global trade strategically, peacefully, and without firing a single shot. What followed was unprecedented. The U.S. delegation traveled to multiple African capitals not to lecture, but to plead. They asked for emergency shipments to stabilize the American food system, but the answer did not come in the form the U.S. hoped for. Africa requested accountability. It requested reparative trade adjustments. It requested equal opportunity for African farmers in global markets and for American corporations to stop dominating agricultural sectors on African soil. It wasn't revenge, it was fairness. Even as negotiations continued, African exports were redirected to other parts of the world. Asia, the Middle East, and South America filled their grain reserves. European nations signed long-term contracts with Africa before the U.S. could reclaim a foothold. Africa was not only asserting power, it was gaining loyal global partners. Inside the United States, a historic debate erupted. One side argued the country needed to regain self-sufficiency and invest in its own agriculture. The other side insisted that America should pressure Africa back into compliance through sanctions and military presence, but the U.S. no longer had the leverage it once did. Africa had military alliances, economic alliances, and diplomatic unity. Old intimidation tactics no longer worked. The global economy had shifted. The world was no longer waiting for the United States to approve the future. Africa had become essential not because other nations needed charity or sympathy, but because Africa had embraced its power. And as the U.S. continued to confront empty shelves and impatient citizens, a question lingered across the world, one the United States had never imagined being asked. What happens when the country that believed it could control global trade is suddenly controlled by it? Africa already knew the answer. The panic inside the United States grew louder with each passing day. Empty shelves became symbols not only of a food shortage but of a collapsing system that had long been taken for granted. Commentators argued endlessly on television, but the debates offered no solutions. The American public didn't want explanations, it wanted food. Social media filled with footage of people driving from store to store, city to city, hoping to find basic groceries. When trucks arrived at distribution centers, lines wrapped around entire city blocks, arguments turned to shoving, then shouting, then fights. It wasn't starvation, not yet, but it was fear, and fear was enough to shake the nation. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Africa watched carefully, unlike the past, when African nations would have been pressured or intimidated into rapid concessions. This time there was unity and patience. African leaders were not eager to humiliate the United States. They were eager to reshape the world. Their message was calibrated and firm. Africa would not reopen trade until structural inequality was resolved, not temporarily adjusted. Short-term aid deals, quick price reductions, or symbolic apologies would not be accepted. What the United States called negotiation had always been manipulation. Africa wasn't falling for it again. In response, the United States attempted its old strategy, divide and conquer. Diplomats contacted individual African nations privately, offering special trade agreements in exchange for breaking the collective stance. But for the first time in modern history, the continent didn't fracture. A unified trade charter had already been signed months earlier, binding agricultural exports to joint decision-making. The United States had not known about it because it assumed Africa would always remain disorganized. That assumption was now destroying it. Within the United States, frustration turned outward. Some accused Africa of aggression, claiming that countries with fewer resources shouldn't have the power to influence superpowers. But others began asking uncomfortable questions. Why had the United States dismantled its own farming industries in favor of cheap foreign imports? Why were African farmers paid far below market value while American corporations reaped massive profits? Why did a country that prided itself on independence become so dependent? Suddenly, Africa didn't look like the villain, it looked like the mirror. Across Europe and Asia, economists were already writing new textbooks. Africa had done something revolutionary. It used economic leverage peacefully to demand dignity. No bombs, no guns, no coups, just unity, intelligence, and timing. The world could no longer see Africa through outdated stereotypes. It was now the strongest agricultural alliance on Earth, and it knew it. In Africa's major cities, the atmosphere was not one of anger but of focus. Farms were expanding, processing centers were opening, young workers were being trained in agricultural engineering, logistics, and export technologies. The crisis in the United States only accelerated African investment in its own growth. Africa didn't want the world to depend on it blindly. Africa wanted respect when it did, but the pressure on the United States intensified. Food banks ran out of supplies. Schools struggled with meal programs. Hospitals reported surges in malnutrition among vulnerable populations. While America had enough wealth to buy food, there was little food available to buy. Domestic farming couldn't scale fast enough. The country had traded long-term security for short-term profit, and the bill had finally arrived. Desperation pushed Washington to consider aggressive responses. Military strategists whispered about protecting supply chains overseas, but Africa was no longer alone. China, Qatar, Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia, and India had invested heavily in African agriculture and infrastructure. Any military interference would trigger global consequences the United States could not afford. The old rulebook simply didn't work anymore. So the negotiation table reopened not in Washington, but in Addis Ababa. It was symbolic and intentional. Africa hosted. The United States traveled. This time there were no lectures, no threats hidden behind diplomatic language. The U.S. delegation listened. Africa's demands were clear. Respect African pricing. Stop suppressing African exports with subsidies and tariffs, end corporate land grabs. Allow African agricultural products full global market access, acknowledge the damage caused by decades of unfair trade practices, guarantee transparency in future contracts. They were not political demands, they were ethical ones. For the United States, agreeing meant admitting something it had denied for generations, that Africa had been exploited, that Africa was owed, that Africa was equal. There was silence in the hall before the delegation responded. The United States agreed. The agreement was historic. No more forced pricing, no more exclusion of African goods from global markets, no more legal loopholes to drain African resources. The world had changed. Africa wasn't rejoining the global trade system as a supplier. It was re-entering as a power. The moment the agreement was signed, the effect was immediate. Agricultural exports resumed to the United States, and American shelves slowly began to refill. Citizens exhaled with relief, but beneath that relief was something darker, a realization that their country was not invincible, that wealth did not guarantee security, and that global power could shift without a single bullet fired. In Africa, the result was transformation. Food export profits tripled. Farmers who had once lived in poverty became part of a rising middle class. Banks financed agricultural expansion instead of limiting it. Students began studying global trade from an African perspective rather than a Western one. The psychological chains, the belief that Africa must always ask permission, finally snapped. And around the world, other regions took note. South America saw itself in Africa's reflection. Southeast Asia recognized the pattern too, where one continent proved that unity was stronger than dependency, others prepared to follow. The United States recovered from the food crisis, but it did not recover from the humiliation. For the first time, it had been forced to bow to a continent it once dismissed. It hadn't been defeated by war, it had been defeated by the very nations it underestimated. Africa didn't celebrate America's pain. Africa celebrated its own awakening. Across the continent, a new sentence echoed in speeches, in classrooms, in markets, in homes. Africa doesn't need to be saved. Africa needs to be respected. And the world, including the United States, finally understood.